You are holy, and your name is holy, and the holy ones every day praise you forever. Okay. Any questions?
Who are the holy ones?
Good. Who are the holy ones? Who do you think?
The righteous.
The righteous?
So we have a suggestion that it's the righteous. We have a suggestion that it is the angels. Welcome. Any other suggestions as to who the holy ones are? Okay, so I will say that there is a lot of correctness in what both of you have said. However, the word Kedoshim, the holy ones, is inclusive of even more than that. So certainly it is the angels, and it is also the righteous. But believe it or not, it's not just the righteous, it's the entire nation of Israel. All Jews are called Kedoshim, holy ones. As it says in Jeremiah, hope I get this right, chapter 2, verse 3. I have to check up later if that's accurate. It says, Kadosh Yisrael LaHashem. Yisrael is holy unto God. Reishis Tivu Aso. He is the first of God's produce. We are the first of his produce. Whatever that means. We'll leave that off for now. Israel is holy unto God. So all Israel is called holy. We're all the holy ones. The angels are the holy ones and the Jews are the holy ones. Okay. So we have the holy ones. Any other questions?
This idea, I mean, I guess it's every time we say Baruch Atah Hashem, but the idea of praising God or giving, saying these wonderful things to God. What's the point?
Okay, what do you think? What's the point of praising God? You don't have to have an answer prepared. That's why I asked the question. But I don't necessarily want to take away your opportunity to contemplate the answer.
It's for us, so we gain something from
Yes,
it.
we gain very much from it. The more that we contemplate God's greatness and express it, because expressing it makes it even more real and concrete for us. That's true with just about anything. There's a story in the Gemara about a woman named Devorah. Devorah was the wife of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was one of the great rabbis of the Tanoic period. Let's say 2nd century around. And he was a student of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Meir, famously a student of Rabbi Akiva. He was married to a woman named Devorah, who herself was the daughter of a very great sage named Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion. She was an incredible woman. She was a very, very strong, brilliant woman who was perhaps more brilliant than the men of her age, which irritated some people. But she grew up her whole life in the home of her father, a great sage, constantly listening to the discussions of her father and the other great Torah minds of the generation. And she clearly had a very strong memory, and she just absorbed everything. So later on, when her husband would be talking to his rabbi friends and they would be discussing matters of Torah, she would frequently pipe in and say, by the way, you're wrong, you're right, or you're all wrong. This is the correct approach, whatever it was. There are many stories about Devorah and her strength of character. Many stories we could talk about, but that's not our topic. The point I wanted to bring out is this one story where she comes into the Beis Medrash, into the study hall, and she sees there's a student there who he's studying quietly. Right now, go into a Beis Medrash. Here, you don't get the same feeling because our Beis Medrash isn't as populated as the great yeshivas. But go into a big yeshiva that has 50, 100 people sitting down and learning. in the base medrash, it's alive.
Is it noisy?
It's very noisy. It
How
is
do they
so
concentrate?
noisy. How do they concentrate? So let me digress to tell you about this. You know, I grew up going to modern Orthodox day schools. And in my education system that I was used to, we never did like classical base medrash learning. We didn't go into the base medrash, take a sefer, sit with a chavrusa, and sort of argue out the text. We never did that. We sat in our neat rows in the classroom. The teacher kind of taught at us. You know, we had to take our notes, raise our hands. It was very rigid. Okay. Then when we graduated high school, you know, it's a very popular thing to do, to go to Israel for a year to learn. So I did that, and I went, and I remember my first day in the base medrash, and I'm sitting there, and there's so much noise. Everybody is talking at the same time because you have these tables of chavrusas, study pairs, study partners, and they're talking out the text with one another, and they're arguing loudly, and the room was so noisy. I was never in such a noisy room where I was expected to hear the person across the table from me and like also be heard. And my chavrus is talking to me, and I couldn't hear him because there was so much noise in the room. And I kept having to lean in and go, "What? What did you say? What did you say?" And he would repeat himself. And it was so frustrating. It was so frustrating. I remember I wanted to cry. Like my first day in the base medrash, I'm like, is this what's going to be for a whole year? This noise, and I have to lean over and repeat and repeat and repeat. This is terrible. I was very upset. But I have to say, the brain is a very powerful thing. If we get to the next bracha, we talk about the brain. The brain is a very powerful thing. And within a short amount of time, maybe within a few days, my brain learned how to tune out all the other noise and to hear only my chavrusa, to the point that as noisy as the room got, I didn't even notice. I didn't even hear anything else. I just heard what my chavrusa was saying to me, and we were like in our own little bubble. We're in a little bubble surrounded by some humming in the background. And it's been like that for me ever since all the years. And I spent, thank God, many years in the base medrash. And for me now, it's a very natural environment. And I enjoy it very much because there's an energy in the room. But anytime I sit down with a new person who's not used to that, I can see them going through the same struggle that I went through. Like, it's so noisy in here. How do you concentrate? How do you learn? But the point is, you sharpen your focus. Your brain actually gets trained to become more focused and gain a greater ability to concentrate. So I'm actually very thankful for that. I think it was a tremendous growth experience, and I'm better off because of it. It's like we had to be what do they call that, with like hazing in the fraternity. They have to initiation. Yeah, like we got initiated into the club of learners.
Customary. That's very customary.
Yeah, they didn't really prepare me for that. They just threw me right into the deep end, and I had to swim. That was it.
I'm surprised in New York you didn't ever see that, because it's
It wasn't part of the milieu of the modern Orthodox education system that I was raised in. It just never occurred, you know? So it was weird to me. I really had no idea what a yeshiva was, as ironic as that sounds, even though I spent, until I was 18, all my years learning in a school that was called the yeshiva, but it wasn't a classical yeshiva. So it was academically a very competitive school. But the mode of learning was like very academic and rigid, and not the classical yeshiva style that we had in Israel. So.
Excuse me, who did you say Buria's father was?
Buria's father was Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion. Sometimes he's called Hanina ben Tradion. It seems to be there's different versions of how his name is spelled. If the yud is between the nuns, Ches nun, yud nun, aleph, Hanina, or if the yud comes after the nun, Hanania. But I think the correct reading is Hanania. Anyway, that being said, yeah, so she comes into the base medrash and she sees a fellow sitting and learning quietly, right, which is against the grain, really. So she walks over to him and she kicks him. And she says, fool, don't you want to remember what you learn? Let your ears hear the words of Torah. Don't just look at it. Don't even just whisper it. And that's one level. But your ears should hear. Say it loudly. And she's a wise woman. Maybe she wasn't so diplomatic. But, and she's, if I could tell you more stories, you'd see how harsh she was some of the time. To some of the great sages, not just to the students. She really, she didn't hold her tongue.
Did she have sisters or brothers?
She had a sister. That's a whole other story. I'm not aware that she had a brother. And I don't know the name of her sister.
Oh.
We're told about her sister because unfortunately her father was one of the 10 martyrs. Heard of the 10 martyrs?
Mm.
So her father was one of the rabbis who was caught teaching Torah publicly, and he was executed in a very gruesome fashion. It's actually a beautiful story. It's a very famous story. What they did is they wrapped him in the Sefer Torah that he was teaching from. But in a printed book, so he taught out of a Torah scroll. They took him and his Torah scroll and they wrapped him in it, and they put wet sponges over his heart, and they lit the Torah on fire, so that he would burn, but he would stay alive. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So he would suffer as much torment as possible. This is a very difficult story to hear, but it's a very moving story because the students were hearing a sound when his execution was taking place. They heard the sound of something fluttering in the air, and they could see that the Rebbe Hanani ben Tradion was looking up at something, and he seemed transfixed by it, and it seemed to be giving him comfort in his last moments. And they said, Rebbe, what do you see? It's very famous. He says, I see the parchment burns, but the letters rise to heaven. And the executioner, so first the students say, Rebbe, breathe in the flames so that you die more quickly. And he says, I don't have a right to do that. My creator gave me this life, and I don't have a right to take it before he chooses to take it from me. And the executioner becomes very moved by the righteousness of this individual, the holiness of Rabbi Hanania, and he has remorse on the spot for what he's doing. And he says but at this point, it's somewhat irreversible. And he says to Rabbi Hanania, he says, Rebbe, says the Roman executioner, Rebbe, if I stoke the flames so that you die more quickly and you suffer less, and I remove the sponges from your heart, will I earn a share in the world to come? Listen to this. He says, yes, you will. Yes. So he removes the sponges, and Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion passes away, and the executioner jumps into the flames after Rabbi Hanania then dies. And the way the story is told is that a voice emerged from heaven and said, this executioner is called immediately to the next world, immediately to paradise, basically, to Gan Eden. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, it says, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, when he heard this, he cried and he said, there are those who spend their entire lives earning a share in the world to come, and there are those who earn it in a single moment. Very, very powerful. So,
why did he earn a share in the world to come?
This is a great question. So on the surface level, the simple level, with that one act of compassion, that single act of compassion.
A little too late.
And yet not too late. Because with the single act of compassion, of reducing the pain of this holy individual, he did teshuvah. Let's put it that way. It was representative of a transformation that happened within him internally. Now, you could say, if he just said to Rabbi Hanani ben Tradion, I regret everything that I'm doing, I'm so remorseful, will God forgive me and bring me to the next world? Would the answer have been yes or no? I don't know. But the way the question was formulated is, if I do this act of compassion, will I earn a place in the world to come? The answer was yes. So I think this also connects incidentally with what you were saying, that giving expression to something internal is more powerful than keeping it in, right? So whether it's saying praises of Hashem instead of just thinking them, but actually expressing them, has a greater impact on us in our thoughts about Hashem than just thinking them alone. Saying words of Torah and hearing them with our ears has a greater impact on us than just looking at them. And here, acting with compassion towards Rabbi Hanina was more transformative than just feeling remorseful at the time. So always giving expression. But the reason I brought up the story is because the Gemara says that it wasn't enough. I mean, the Romans were really the worst. They were the worst. It wasn't enough that they kill Rabbi Hanina ben Hanani ben Tradion. I think they also executed his wife, and they took his daughter, his unmarried daughter. Beruya was married. For whatever reason, they left him alone. They left her alone, Beruya. But they took his unmarried daughter, Beruya's sister, and they put her into a house of ill repute. They forced her into that lifestyle, to basically be a slave for whatever Roman would come along and, want to use her. Now, the happy ending to that story is that Rabbi Meir jailbreaks her. Rabbi Meir, Beruya's husband, breaks her out of jail. However, when he's going to do it, Beruya actually puts a condition on it. He says, I want you to first test my sister to see if she has remained chaste. And if she hasn't, then I want you to leave her there. But if she remains pure, then you can extricate her. So,
Who said that?
Beruya, the sister.
How could she be
What does chaste mean, though?
Well, okay, what does chaste mean? I think it means, in other words, if she was defiled against her will, I don't think that's what is meant.
Okay.
The question is whether or not she has
participating?
become willing or remains pure at heart, let's say. So Rabbi Meir goes in disguise. I mean, it's a little hard to hear that he disguised himself. He disguised his identity from his own sister-in-law, but he goes in essentially as a client, and he begins to speak to her to see how she'll respond to him, and she makes every excuse why she cannot engage with him, right? And so he realizes that she's still tsanua, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he follows his wife's instructions to go ahead then and bribe the guard to allow him to take her out. And that's a whole other story. There's a lot to the story of Beruya and Rabbi Meir. But anyway, you asked if she had any siblings. So the Gemara does tell us this much about her sister. That's all I know as far as her siblings. A very great woman was Beruya. A very great woman was she.
Yes.
I could tell you more stories about Beruya, just so you know how great she is, but it's way off topic. I don't want to short shrift the class because we're on topic.
Well, is there any other answer to why we praise Hashem?
So what we're back to that. So the simple answer is because it brings an awareness to us of Hashem's greatness, and the more aware we are of that, the greater benefit it is to us because it allows us to connect more deeply with Him, have a more meaningful and honest relationship with Him. I don't know if there's another answer. In other words, it's not like God needs it. But you could say, and I don't know if you were here for that class, when we talked about blessing God and the idea of in that class, we were talking about the fact that Hashem put us here to emulate Him and to be godlike. We're meant to be godlike, and God is the ultimate giver, and therefore we also have to act as givers in order to bring ourselves closer to God in resemblance. So one of the ways that we do that is God gives us the opportunity to offer something to Him, even though He doesn't actually need it, but He still gives us that opportunity. So He could say, praise me, and then we could, of our own volition, go and offer praise to God, and that makes us it puts us into an act of giving towards God, and we become givers.
I think often about your question, Lori, or I've thought about it in the past, and the conclusion that I came to was just simply that, when you're in the face of such power and perfection, there is no other expression that really makes sense. Like, for instance, if you're asking for something, or the only thing that we can say in the face of God's perfection is simply to praise Him. It's like that's all there is, really. So that's why I've often thought that we praise God, because even though I know that we can ask Him for things, even though we've talked about that in earlier lessons, but logically, it's all you can really do if you take the notion of God seriously and what God means in our religion. And so that's, personally, I've told myself that that's why we do it so much. It's one of the few things we can logically do that isn't somehow questionable or somehow lower than.
But it's ultimately, what do we gain from it? Because ultimately, it's about giving to us.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that, yeah. It should be about what we get from it, but...
So what do we get?
So it's both at the same time, meaning we've spoken earlier on in other sessions that Hashem's purpose in creating the world was to give to us. He's the giver and we're the receiver. And there's a lot to say about that. However, we also said that in order for us to receive, the mode in which we receive is by emulating God. And it's a deep topic that we spent a lot of time on in class number 3. So I would say go back to that recording of class number 3 and check that out, and you'll see what that's about. That the way that we receive is by emulating God in His giving capacity. So if we are self-focused, it almost limits what we can receive. But if the more we focus outward, ironically, the more we actually increase our capacity to receive.
That's it. I think that's it. I think when we are thinking outwardly about beautiful creations around us and all that God does for us, we feel richer and deeper from that.
Right. We've definitely touched on this in earlier classes about why chesed, the attribute of kindness, is also described as gadol or gedula, greatness or bigness, largeness. And this is something Devorah Leah said about the giver is not diminished by giving. The giver is actually their capacity becomes broader. Right? So there's an irony, but that by giving we actually are in a certain way expanding ourselves. Not diminishing or decreasing ourselves. So therefore, we're given the opportunity to focus not just on us. But I want to respond to what you said, because I hadn't considered what you said before, but I think it's really brilliant. Because when we see, go on a vacation, go on a trip, and go and you see some beautiful work of nature. You see the Alps, you see Mount Rainier. When I first saw Mount Rainier, I nearly fell on the floor. I was just like, what's our natural reaction to those things? We just go, wow. It's just an instinctive reaction. It's a natural reaction to something that is awesome. We react with an expression of praise. That is so beautiful. That is so incredible. A sunset, whatever it is. We're hardwired to have that reaction. And the fact that Kedoshim, the holy ones, who are the holy ones? The angels have no free will. And what do they spend all day doing? Praising God. Why? Because they don't choose to praise, but for them it's hardwired. It's an instinctive reaction because they are on a level that they can perceive much more of God's greatness than we can. And so therefore their natural reaction to that is they are constantly praising God. And if we would have the same realization that they would have, we would also do that naturally. The problem is there's a concealment. So we are trying to break down those walls and go through the motions of, this is what I ought to be expressing if I really had the closeness that I want to have. So we express it anyway. We express it anyway because, as we've been saying all along, that through outward expressions of things, it makes an inward impression. The outward expression makes an inward impression. And that's a very fundamental concept in Judaism of why even the mitzvos at all. It's very, very deep. But one approach to why the mitzvos at all, the commandments, require of us to do physical actions at all, like we said, God doesn't need, but we benefit greatly by them. If you read the Sefer HaChinuch, it goes through from the beginning of the Torah till the end in order. It goes through the commandments that are in the Torah. And for each one, he offers an explanation, a reasonable explanation of what benefit do we get from doing this. And he gives a practical benefit, a practical worldly benefit that we get from doing these commandments. And it's not just like, oh, we benefit physically, but he says how we sort of transform our personality and we transform our character traits in a more positive direction by performing these actions, right? So, and the way he says it is, I believe his expression is, ha'adam nif'al al pi pe'ulosav. That means the man is affected by his actions. Adam nif'al, he is acted upon. That's literally means what nif'al means. A man is acted upon al pi, according to pe'ulosav, his actions. The actions that you do outwardly actually acts upon you simultaneously. So that would hold true also for praising. So you are holy, and your name is holy, and the holy ones every day praise you forever. So this is some depth that Cliff gave us as to that it says the holy ones, the angels, and Yisrael. Then in a certain way we're emulating the angels because we have an understanding that, well, this is what they're doing. They're praising God. That's the natural reaction to the realization of God's greatness. And we want to also realize God's greatness, so let's go through the motions and make that impact upon ourselves.
As if we were confronting Mount Rainier for the first time.
In a certain way. Yeah, I mean, I was really blown away. I'm a Brooklyn boy, so I had no idea what a mountain looked like. You know, I was like, wow,
awesome.
I can speak a lot about Mount Rainier. I have a lot of thoughts about Mount Rainier. But it's not our topic. What time check?
25 after.
Okay. So here, there's 3 expressions of the word holy. You are holy, your name is holy, and the holy ones praise you forever. Likewise, when the Chazan repeats the Shemona Esrei and reaches this paragraph, there's a responsive section here. Most of Shemona Esrei, with the exception of this paragraph and later the Thanksgiving, we just listen to the Chazan's repetition and we answer Amen to each blessing. Here, there's a whole responsive section where the Chazan gives us introduction of how the angels praise God on high, and this is what they say. They call to one another and say, and then we all join in, we all chime in, and we say, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, Melo chol haaretz kevodo, the entire earth is filled with his glory. So here there is even in the silent Shemona Esrei, there is already an allusion to that threefold praise of holy, 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 and that we have 3 holies. You are holy, your name is holy, and the holy ones praise you forever. So I want to examine these 3 holies because I think it's worthwhile to understand why there's 3 and what they are. So we'll just go through that. You are holy and your name is holy. What is the difference between those 2 expressions? So again, I refer you back to class number 3. It was a very fundamental class. We spoke about the hidden aspect of God and the revealed aspect of God. And that there's God as the infinite, unbounded, unlimited one. And it is that unlimitedness and unboundedness to which we don't have full access because it's beyond our experience. All that we have access to is the way that God interacts with us in the created world. And that, we said, is called God's name. God's name, which God has many of them, each one of those names is an expression of a different way in which Hashem acts in the world. And this was a conversation that took place between Hashem and Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe asks Hashem, tell me your name. What is your name? I want to know your name. What should I tell the Jews? Your name. And so in the straightforward story in the Chumash, Hashem says, my name is I will be what I will be. Ehiyah asher ehiyah. And the question is, what does that mean? Right? So the Midrash elucidates this. When God says, you want to know my name, basically, and this is what we spoke about in class number 3, that essentially God has no name. God in his essence is not limited by a name. He doesn't have a name like you and I have a name. He is what he is. But he does interact with us in different forms and with different attributes, you might say, what we experience as attributes, what we see as attributes. And each one of those, when God acts in a different way, we call him something else. So there are names that signify kindness, and names that signify mercy, and names that signify harsh judgment. And that is what Hashem says to Moshe in this Medrash. When I act in this way, I am called this name. And when I act in that way, I am called that name. And that's what he means. He says, I will be that which I will be. My name will be according to the way that I reveal myself in that particular place and time. So God's name is somewhat changing. So therefore, the name of God signifies the relationship that we have with God, the way in which God is relating with us. Is that revelation is called his name. So we're saying, Hashem, you are holy, and your name is holy. Now we have to understand what it means to be holy. What does it mean to be holy?
It's the difference between God and his name.
Is that
the name is the way it happens to be manifesting.
Right.
Physically or...
Right, because God in his essence is not limited by that name. But we can identify God's interactions with us and put a name on that, put a stamp on that, say, this is God acting in this manner.
And God does have many names.
And he has many names. So what does it mean to be holy? So you are holy, your name is holy. What does holy mean? In early classes, what does it mean blessed? It was a whole thing, because we just say these words and we don't know. Holy, what does it mean?
We contrast it, like Shabbat is holy.
Okay, good.
We contrast it to the mundane.
Right. So separate is one of the classical definitions of holiness, is separateness. And it's not inaccurate, but it's also not fully expressive of what holiness is, because we're saying kadosh. There's a parsha in the Torah, kedoshim tihiyu, which means you shall be holy. We're commanded to be holy. You shall be holy. Ki kadosh ani, because I am holy, says God. Right? You be holy because I am holy. And Rashi over there classically says, kedoshim tiyu. What does it mean? You should be holy. Perushim tiyu. Parush means set aside, separated. You should be separate, removed. From what? From sinful acts. The Ramban goes to say you should be removed from even non-sinful acts that are too much of a physical indulgence. Because there are many permitted acts, and yet a person can overindulge in what's permitted and debase themselves. So beyond the letter of the law of what's permitted and not permitted, take a step back and hold yourself even higher.
So, I'm wondering, is holiness defined as simply that which God says and what he does? I mean, if he's the final source of morality in the universe, if he is the source of all morality, then holy simply means godly, like God, as we learn about him through the Torah, through what he tells us to do, through what he does, how we see him. I mean, all morality ultimately has only one reference point, and that's God. And morality is not relative; it's not something we think about or derive. It's just whatever God says. Whatever God is by definition holy. But that's a thought that I've had in the past about about really the intrinsic meaning of holy is simply to be godlike, to understand, not godlike in the sense of trying to be, God with a little g, but simply understanding that all morality comes from one source and from one point of reference, and that is God.
So I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't think anything what you said is wrong. I'm not sure if that necessarily is the definition of the word kadosh. I'm going to offer what I think, and it could be that these ideas go together. But what I was beginning with is that we say kadosh, holy, means separate, but it doesn't just mean separate, because separateness would seem to be like you push away everything else and you go aside and you're over here and this is over there and there's no interaction between the two. And yet we say V'shimcha kadosh, and your name is holy, and the name represents God's interaction with the world. So we're not saying you're separate from the world and you have nothing to do with this world. We're saying there's something about you that's distinct and different and elevated above this world that we can't touch. And yet, V'shimcha kadosh, you have a name. You do relate to us. You do relate to this world. You do bring that holiness into this world, so that this is where I want to go with this. And we look at that praise of holy, holy, holy are you, Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory, it says, right? Now, those two statements would seem to contradict each other on a plain level, because you're separate, you're so separate, right? The whole world is filled with your glory. Wait a second. Are you separate, or is the whole earth filled with your glory? So it's one or the other, right? So no, God is above and distinct and greater than and higher than and elevated above. But God teaches us, don't keep all that to yourself. You have to use that to descend and imbue that which is beneath you with that holiness, meaning you have to elevate that which is not elevated. You be elevated, but don't just stay aloof and say, I'm up here, you're down there, nanny kishkins. Let me reach down to you, reach my hand down, and you reach your hand up. I'm thinking like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting. We're not allowed to depict God physically, but it's a moving expression. You have the hand reaching down and the hand reaching up, and to a certain degree, the Torah does describe God in physical terms. We're meant to understand it metaphorically, but it says, Dibra Torah Bilshon B'nai Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of man. There's a reason that God is described physically, not because we're to attribute to him physical properties. We're forbidden from doing that. It's one of the 13 principles of faith, is that God does not have corporeality, but to understand in a certain way how God behaves by describing it in terms of man. So God reaches down to us and he lifts us up out of the muck, like a guy's sinking in his quicksand, as long as he can get his hand up above, so he can be pulled out. So God is elevating the earth. He is holy in his place, but yet he reaches down, Shemcha Kadosh, his name is holy, his interactions with the world, he's bringing that specialness down. Holy is special is another good definition of holy. It's special. Kedusha could be specialness. And then Kedoshim, then we have at the bottom, we have the Kedoshim. We have those of us who are down here on earth, and yet we also are imbued with holiness. We're also lifted up. We're also given that quality. So what I think the idea of holiness is yes, there has to be a degree that we have to raise ourselves up above a certain baseline, but not to be aloof, but to then dip back down and elevate that which is beneath us and bring it upwards. And that's what God does, and that's what we're expressing here. And therefore, we also have to be godlike in that way and act in that way also. And that is the whole idea of the mitzvahs, of all the commandments, is that we interact with the physical world. We take physical things and we elevate them. Avraham Avinu came along. People think Avraham was the first monotheist. What did Avraham bring into the world? Monotheism. It's not true, because even our sources tell us there was an institution called the Yeshiva of Shem ve'Aver. There was a place of study of God, learning about God, that was headed by two righteous men, Shem and Aver, and they also taught about God. So what did Avraham bring along that was so revolutionary? So this idea I'm saying over from Akiva Tatzi as a class on this, that essentially what Avram brought into the world was, as opposed to what might have been the idea before of God's holiness, is that he is sort of aloof and separate from the world. And if you want to approach God and spirituality, you have to disconnect yourself with the physical world, because the physical pleasures draw you away from spiritual pursuits and thoughts of God and spiritual living. And Avraham brought into the world the idea that no, that you can find God in nature, you can find God in everyday activities, eat food, thank the Creator for the food, and that our sages teach us that even Avraham Avinu practiced what would later become commanded to the Jews as mitzvos, as commandments. Avraham practiced them voluntarily because with his great intellect, he deduced that this is what the will of God was. In other words, not that it was a requirement, but that God created this world, and there are ways that we can elevate it. There are ways that we can imbue the whole world with godliness. And so he, on his own, figured out what physical acts would be appropriate in the service of God and in the sanctification of the world. So that's the idea of that's the Jewish idea of Kedusha. There is something we bring into the world from above. There is something above, we attach to the above, and we bring it down here.
Can you repeat that?
Which
so
part?
Avraham figured out what physical acts
were appropriate
were
to bring godliness into the physical earth.
Thank you.
What's that?
I just was saying.
Yeah. So the one thing that I wanted to share is, so we as Jews, we're a light to the nations. We're a light to the nations, meaning we are meant to follow the Torah and connect with God and make these physical expressions and sort of reveal godliness on earth and let others see that, and through that they have the ability to have a connection with God, even though they're not obligated in all the commandments we are. We're called the nation of priests. We act as sort of guides and teachers to the world, but not everyone has to conform to the same obligations.
Since for a second asking it, Cliff was talking about ethics or morals. I mean, doesn't that fit nicely into all of this? That, how can we act morally and ethically to each other?
Yes. Yeah, I know. I'm not denying at all that acknowledging God as the source and bringing his example down into this world and acting in this manner, that's certainly part of what we're talking about when we describe what Kedusha is. What is Kedusha not? It's not separation in terms of strict separation. I'm over here and you're over there. It's holding ourselves like God above and then reaching down and pulling up. Reaching down and bringing up. So we are bringing into the world from a higher source.
This holiness, this thing that we're bringing in, this godliness, this holiness, it's acting in an ethical, moral way.
It's certainly part of it.
What else?
Well, maybe nothing else. Maybe nothing else. Meaning, what do I mean by that? We really have to pause. But meaning, when the potential convert comes to Hillel and says, this is very deep, but I don't have time to go into the depth. Ask me next week. Leave on a cliffhanger. It's okay. He says, teach me the whole, right? Teach me the whole Torah standing on one foot.
Right.
He says, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto another. It's a very moralistic statement. He says, that is the whole Torah, Everything else is commentary. Now go and learn, right? Now go and learn the commentary. But it's very strange. That means that the whole Torah in one sentence is essentially, it's a moral directive. And that means that every single mitzvah is an expression of that moral directive. Shabbos is morality. Kosher is morality. Prayer is morality. The animal sacrifices is morality. The 613 mitzvahs, some of them are more obviously moral than others, but the point is people tend to separate and say there's the moral laws and there's the ritual laws. I do the moral things. I set aside the ritual things. But it seems that our sages, led by Hillel himself, felt the entire Torah was an expression of a moral objective. So the question is, how is that so? How is that so? So therefore, I'm not arguing. Yes, is there anything more than morality? Perhaps not. But all the commandments are moral. And where does morality come from? It comes from the one above.
That's it.
It's not invented by us.
It starts and finishes because there are things that God tells us to do in the Torah that would seem to be quite brutal. Wipe out the economy, all of these things, and yet we're bidden to accept that everything God has told us to do is completely moral, even though it might offend our present sensibilities or whatever. So He really is the full arbiter of the very meaning of morality. Anyway.
Right. So the question is how, and that's a question we'll save for later.